Hi guys, today a quick comparison between Sony's two premium Zeiss branded lenses in the 50mm range. They've got a new one out that's a 50mm f1.4 and it's going up against some pretty stiff competition in the few-year-old 55 1.8. And honestly, this is the lens that sold me on the mirrorless system. You could get this kind of performance in this small of a package that's not a $4,000, $5,000 Leica. Really, it's a great option for the mirrorless mount. So Sony comes along with their line of massive fast lenses, and the 35mm f1.4 falls into this category, as do the new GM lenses. And with this lens line, they're really announcing, hey, you know what? We want to give users an option not just to go lightweight and small, but also to get ultimate image quality, a super fast lens, and above and beyond the performance that their earlier lenses provided. So I asked Sony for an evaluation loaner copy of this lens a few weeks ago, right before I was set to depart on a trekking trip to Nepal. And I took some image samples and compared it to this lens with the idea that I was going to do this comparison video and release it right before I went on my trip. And initially my first impressions were, hey, you know what? This lens really isn't that much better than the older 55mm lens. In fact, I don't see much difference at all. Why should I even bother carrying this beast of a lens, the 100 miles or so or 150 miles that I'm getting ready to trek in Nepal? It's double the weight. It's huge. It's a little bit intimidating when you mount it on this camera and start sticking it in people's faces. And then I started really looking at the image samples, and I thought to myself, this lens really does offer some unique qualities different than what the older lens offers. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to bite the bullet. I'm going to schlep this lens in my backpack through the Himalayas, and let's take a look at some of the results. I don't want to just look at the sharpness of this lens, because it definitely is sharper than the 55 1.8, but it's the overall feel and look of the lens which I find more pleasing and superior to the older lens. I mean, whether or not you think it's worth the money and the extra size and weight, that's going to be up to you, but I think this lens definitely is better. Let's take a look. This image, for example, was shot at 2.8, and take a look at the background blur. Really pleasing blur here. You get some nice subtle round bokeh balls, and at the same time you still get great sharpness and great detail if we zoom on in. In my opinion, this lens is not quite at the same level as the GM 85 1.4, especially when it's shot wide open, but here at 2.8 it sure does look great. Another example, shooting into the light. This is a chance where you might expect to get some flaring. Very little flaring. You see a little bit of veiling here around the glass where the sun's shining into it. Shot at f5. Love the color in this shot. And this is also one of my favorite shots taken with the lens. Notice the background blur here. Beautiful bokeh balls here. Wonderful sharpness if we zoom in. So this is just a great example of the sort of picture you can achieve with this lens, which is just a little bit more pleasing, a little bit more up-to-date and modern than the older and smaller lens. Another shot. To me, this lens really exemplifies what Zeiss has made famous as sort of that Zeiss 3D pop look. And again, wonderful detail if we zoom in, and the background is rendered absolutely beautifully, and this is even at f5.6 in a real distant background. And just so we're comparing apples to apples, I want to also look at some shots I've taken over the last few months with the 55 1.8, just so you can see that even with this lens, even at half the price, half the weight, you're still getting some outstanding sharpness, maybe not quite on the same level as the newer lens, but for the money, I think you're getting a terrific lens, and this is really why I'm not so keen to switch. Let's zoom on in and check out some of the detail here. It's still, I mean, it's outstanding, maybe not mind-blowing, a little bit inferior to the 1.4, but still an excellent, excellent lens for the money. And here's an example of some of the background blur with the 55 1.8. You can see maybe not quite as pleasing to the eye, slightly harsher than the 55 1.4. And I would call that pretty darn good sharpness. Not quite as good as the 1.4, but take a look at a few more sample shots here. And here's an example of the sort of image you can get with the 55 1.8. You still do get a little bit of that Zeiss 3D pop. Probably not quite as pronounced as with the newer and larger, more expensive lens, but still fairly outstanding, I think. And this is a sort of shot that helps you really kind of distinguish between the high quality, sort of roundish bokeh and a little bit less harsh bokeh of the newer lens versus here we see sort of cat eye bokeh, a little bit harsher the way the the highlights sort of blend together. It's slightly harsher. So you're definitely getting something for your money with the more expensive lens, but still getting some excellent detail as we crop in. Another shot with the 55. We zoom in. Again, if you nail the focus, you're still able to pull wonderful detail from crops on the 55. One of the things I really love about this lens, and your background is not quite as smooth, not quite as attractive, but still pretty darn good. Just for fun, let's take a look at a few pictures taken with the A-mount Sony Zeiss 50mm f1.4. Now, A-mount's making a bit of a resurgence right now with the announcement of the A99 Mark II and the increased sales for the A68. So the mount's not dead, and so this lens is still relevant. At the time I bought it, this was a state-of-the-art lens, 3+ years ago. So let's take a look and see how it compares to some shots taken with the E-mount lenses. When you click in on some of the shots taken with this, now again, this is with the 24 megapixel A99, the original A99, just not getting the same level of detail and the same level of sharpness with this lens, and a lot of that could be attributed to the sensor, not necessarily the optics, but still we're getting a little bit, you can see some of the shape of the iris here, some of the angles. And this wasn't exactly stopped down that much. I mean, this was at 3.2, so almost wide open, just stop and a half from wide open, and we're still already getting a little bit of the shape of the iris. So not a perfectly round iris. That contributes to some image quality issues on this lens. And one area where we really can compare apples to apples on the two lenses is the rendering of the bokeh in the background. And to me, this lens, the old A-mount, the 3 or 4 year old A-mount 50mm Zeiss, has kind of bokeh more reminiscent of the 55 1.8 and probably performance more in line with that lens too. And here's another example of some bokeh rendering with the A-mount 50mm. You can see that as we start to get off center, the bokeh balls start getting kind of oblong. The proverbial cat eye bokeh, and as we zoom in, we see we're even getting a little bit of the onion ring bokeh, which until Sony started their latest marketing campaign, not too many people were even aware was an issue. There's a little bit more here, we can see it. So yeah, I mean, the A-mount 50 is, unfortunately, if you own one, the latest generation of 50mm lenses from Sony are kind of rendering this lens as, yesteryear's technology. And again, just for comparison's sake, going back, this is the A7R2 with the new 50mm 1.4, and just take a look at some of the bokeh there, compare it with the previous shot. We can see even off center, we're getting rounder bokeh balls, still a little bit of a cat eye as we get off center. It's kind of hard to avoid that entirely, but overall, a better looking bokeh. We're not getting some of the onion ring issues, and of course, overall sharpness and level of detail is much, much better with this lens, especially when paired with the latest generation sensor. Overall, I think with this lens, you're paying for it, but you're getting a better quality overall rendition, the most up-to-date modern look. Granted, it weighs twice as much as the 55mm, and at $1,500, it costs twice as much. You can get the 55 now, gray market, new for $700 or $750. So personally, I think the 55mm is the best buy and probably the best lens you can get for the money for your mirrorless system. Okay, so you've had a look at some of the image samples, and you can obviously draw your own conclusions. In my opinion, when you're spending double the money for this lens, you really should expect double the image quality. Look at the pictures. Do you get it? Well, that decision is up to you. Personally, I am not going to be upgrading from this lens. I think this is a really great combination of performance, cost, and size. One of the best lenses you can get still for your mirrorless mount system. This lens is an outstanding image quality, very fast, beautiful bokeh, lovely contrast. Really nothing you can say bad about this lens other than the fact that it's very heavy. and it's very expensive. So whether or not that's a trade-off you're willing to make is totally up to you. For me, I'm sticking with this one. So there you go, folks. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful.